Imagine a war so vast, it stretched from the icy wilderness of Alaska to the humid jungles of the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers were sent to remote places they couldn't even locate on a map before the conflict. But here's the real kicker. When they arrived, there were no barracks, no houses, not even a roof above their heads, just mud, rain, and the brutal elements. So how did the US military solve this problem? They didn't ship lumber across the world. They didn't waste time constructing elaborate bases. Instead, they came up with one of the most unique and effective solutions you've probably never heard of: the Quonset Hut, a curved, corrugated steel half-cylinder that could be set up anywhere, anytime, to keep soldiers alive. And here's a jaw-dropping number. Over 100,000 of these huts were built during World War II. That's not a typo. That's an industrial flood of steel and sweat turned into shelters, hospitals, command centers, and even chapels. Imagine landing on a distant Pacific island in 1943 and watching one of these huts spring up from the earth in just one day, ready to house dozens of men. It almost sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it was real. Here's the twist. These huts weren't just quick fixes for military needs. They were a quiet revolution in logistics and housing. Think about it. World War II wasn't only about bullets and tanks. It was fought with supply lines, infrastructure, and the ability to keep soldiers fed, sheltered, and ready. While the Germans had their fortresses and the Japanese had their caves, the Americans had a portable, packable, indestructible hut that could be shipped flat, assembled by a few soldiers, and withstand a typhoon. That's the kind of edge that never makes it into Hollywood war films, but it made all the difference. Now you might be thinking, it's just a hut, so what? Here's why you'll want to pay attention. These huts didn't vanish when the war ended. After 1945, they became a part of American life. They were used as college dorms, churches, diners, and even housing for returning GIs under the GI Bill. Some are still standing today, rusting but resilient. Reminders of a time when America cranked out war gear at a pace never seen before in history. In this video, we'll dive into how the Quonset Hut came to be, how it spread like wildfire across the globe, what life inside one was really like, and how something originally designed to be temporary left a permanent mark on history. It's a story of steel, sweat, and pure American ingenuity. Trust me, you'll never look at a half-cylinder the same way again. By late 1941, the US was facing a logistical nightmare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had dragged America into a global war, requiring troops in every corner of the globe. Millions of men were about to ship out, and each of them needed food, water, and a roof over their heads. But the challenge was clear. How do you house an army on the move? Traditional wooden barracks took too long to build, and shipping heavy construction materials across the globe was impossible. The military needed something new, fast, cheap, portable, and tough enough to withstand everything from blizzards to monsoons. This wasn't just about comfort. Soldiers fighting in remote locations like North Africa, the Pacific Islands, or frigid Alaskan outposts couldn't afford to be weakened by exposure. A sick or exhausted soldier wasn't just one man down. It was a break in the chain of war. Military planners knew they had to solve the shelter problem before it spiraled into lost battles. The question wasn't if they could come up with a solution, but how quickly they could create something that would keep their men alive and ready to fight. The solution wasn't about the concept. It was about how quickly it could be done. Enter the Navy. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the US Navy realized they would need portable housing for their growing bases. They didn't want bulky tents that would tear in the wind or wooden shacks that would rot in the jungle. They needed a building that could be packed up, shipped anywhere, and easily assembled with minimal tools. A structure that could be built in hours, not weeks. At the time, the US military had experimented with the Nissan hut, a design from World War I by Major Peter Nissan. This curved steel structure had been used by the British in France, but the American planners thought it wasn't quite right. They wanted something simpler, sturdier, and better suited to mass production in American factories. They needed a uniquely American version. That's where Quonset Point, Rhode Island comes into play. It's where the Navy commissioned the first prototype of what would later be called the Quonset Hut. The timing couldn't have been better. As the nation was gearing up for total war in 1941, the rush was on to build not just weapons and ships, but a portable system to house the soldiers who would fight. By the time US troops started shipping out in early 1942, the groundwork for their future homes was already in place. What seemed like a simple curved shell was, in reality, the solution to one of the biggest logistical challenges of World War II. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't flashy. But without it, thousands of men would have been left exposed to not just enemy fire, but to the harsh elements of weather and terrain. This wasn't just architecture, it was about survival. And America was about to demonstrate that solving problems quickly and at scale was one of its greatest strengths in the war. When the Navy issued a call in 1941 for a new type of building, the task landed in the hands of architects and engineers at George A. Fuller Company, working at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island. The assignment seemed simple on paper, but in practice it was monumental. Create a structure that was light, affordable, compact, and easy enough for untrained personnel to assemble with basic tools. It had to be durable enough to withstand tropical heat, Arctic cold, and everything in between. The design they came up with was brilliantly simple. A half-cylinder made of corrugated steel sheets arched into a 16x36 FT structure. The semi-circular shape wasn't just aesthetic, it provided incredible strength, allowing wind, rain, and snow to slide right off. At each end, plywood panels could be fitted with doors, windows, or vents, depending on the environment and function. Inside, the huts could be lined with insulation or left bare. The entire structure was mounted on a basic wooden or concrete foundation, depending on the location. The first prototypes were built at Quonset Point in mid-1941, giving the huts their name. They weren't luxurious, they weren't flashy, but they were exactly what the Navy needed. They could be packed into crates small enough to fit on ships and planes, shipped thousands of miles, and assembled on site. A crew of 6 to 8 men could set one up in a single day. Compare that to weeks of building traditional wooden barracks, and you can see why the Quonset Hut was an instant success. The initial design, however, wasn't perfect. The first huts were 16 feet wide, which turned out to be too cramped for some uses. Engineers quickly expanded the design to 20 feet wide, and eventually versions up to 40 feet wide were created. Variants soon emerged for all kinds of purposes, from barracks to mess halls, offices, hospitals, and even chapels. The modular design allowed huts to be linked together, expanded or modified as needed. This flexibility was invaluable in war zones, where requirements could change at a moment's notice. By late 1941, the Navy had already placed massive orders. The design was set, and factories began cranking out corrugated steel panels by the ton. The Quonset Hut was officially rolling off production lines, even as America was still reeling from the Pearl Harbor attack. By the time US troops landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the huts were already in place, ready to shelter them. It's easy to think of the Quonset Hut as inevitable today, but it wasn't. It was born out of a specific moment of necessity, combining industrial strength and practical design. Without Quonset Point, without that Navy order, and without the fast work of those engineers, the war in the Pacific and beyond might have played out very differently. The brilliance of the Quonset Hut was in its simplicity. Steel arches, plywood ends, and a promise. No matter where American troops went, they would have a place to call home, even if only for one night. Once the design was finalized in 1941, the United States didn't just build Quonset Huts, they produced them in staggering numbers. America's industrial power was already gearing up to build Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a hut to the list seemed small, but it became one of the war's most prolific products. By 1945, more than 100,000 Quonset Huts had been produced, enough to house entire armies. How was this done? The answer lay in mass production. Factories across the country were retooled to stamp out steel sheets, cut plywood panels, and package kits containing every nut, bolt, and instruction needed. Each hut came as a flat-pack kit weighing around 5 tons. It could be loaded into the hold of a Liberty ship alongside jeeps, rations, and ammunition, then offloaded anywhere in the world. The Fuller Company and other contractors didn't waste time on complicated blueprints. Every hut was standardized, allowing workers to assemble them like cars on an assembly line. The dimensions were consistent, the parts interchangeable, and the instructions simple. A Quonset Hut kit was like a giant Lego set for grown men, except these pieces built the infrastructure of a global war. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, the Navy placed an order for over 25,000 huts right away, and production only ramped up from there. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later across the Midwest operated around the clock. By 1943, entire ships left American ports carrying nothing but Quonset Hut kits, and the men trained to assemble them. The pace was so fast that huts were often constructed faster than the military could decide where they should go. But the real marvel was how few men it took to raise one. 6 or 8 soldiers, armed with wrenches and hammers, could build a hut in under a day. No cranes, no skilled carpenters, no engineers on site, just manpower and a box of parts. This speed meant that newly captured islands could be transformed into functional bases almost overnight. Airstrips quickly had barracks for pilots, kitchens for mess halls, and offices for command posts. A patch of jungle could become a mini-city in less than a week. It's worth comparing this to the enemy. While German troops were digging into bunkers and Japanese forces were burrowing into caves, American forces were constructing steel towns that rose almost instantly. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that wherever the U.S. flag was planted, a functional base quickly followed. By the end of the war, production numbers rivaled some of the largest military hardware programs in history. Quonset huts weren't just places to live. They were symbols of America's ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild its enemies. Sending soldiers overseas was one thing. Giving them a ready-made home, waiting in a crate wherever they landed, was something else entirely. Living inside a Quonset hut was unlike anything most American soldiers had ever experienced. For many, it was their first time away from home, and suddenly their house was a curved shell of corrugated steel sitting on foreign soil. These huts were no luxury homes, but compared to sleeping in tents that leaked rain and froze at night, they were a godsend. The interiors could be adjusted depending on the theater of war. In the South Pacific, huts were often lined with insulation to help with the sweltering heat, and screens were added to keep mosquitoes out. In colder areas like Alaska or Northern Europe, stoves were installed at each end to keep the cold at bay. Wooden floors helped keep men out of the mud, and partitions offered a touch of privacy. Still, many soldiers remembered them as loud, echoing, and unbearably hot during the day. But here's the thing, Quonset huts weren't just barracks. Their flexibility allowed them to transform into whatever the military needed at the time. Some became mess halls, where hundreds of men lined up for rations. Others turned into field hospitals, with rows of cots and the scent of antiseptic in the air. Some served as chapels with makeshift altars built under the curved roof, where soldiers sang hymns thousands of miles from home. There were huts used as command posts, storage depots, classrooms, and even theaters for impromptu movie nights. If it needed a roof, a Quonset hut could provide one. A soldier arriving at an island like Guadalcanal in 1943 would have seen a sea of huts springing up almost overnight, transforming a raw jungle patch into a fully functional military camp. The huts gave a strange sense of permanence in places that were otherwise alien and hostile. They were symbols of American ingenuity, proof that no matter where you were sent, some form of structure and order would follow. Of course, there were downsides. The steel walls amplified the sound of rain until it was deafening. In the tropics, the interior could feel like an oven. Ventilation was often poor, and humidity could warp the wooden ends. But soldiers adapted, rigging up makeshift fans, cutting extra windows, and doing whatever it took to make the huts livable. After all, compared to foxholes or open-air tents, this was still a step up. Letters from GIs often mentioned the huts, sometimes with humor, sometimes with complaints, but always with gratitude for having something between them and the elements. As one Marine stationed in the Pacific put it, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out." That's all a man can ask for. Perhaps most importantly, the huts provided a strange sense of normalcy. You could hang your gear on a nail, set up your cot, and know that at least for the night you weren't at the mercy of the jungle or desert. For a soldier far from home, that small comfort was more valuable than gold. The Quonset hut didn't just stay in American camps. It spread across the globe, following US forces wherever they advanced. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea, these half-moon shelters became part of the landscape of World War II. No matter how remote the location, it was likely that a cluster of huts formed the backbone of a military base. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. When US Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943 or on Iwo Jima in 1945, establishing a foothold wasn't just about securing land. It was about building infrastructure. Quonset huts were essential for that. Airfields needed control towers, radio rooms, weather stations, and maintenance shops, places that couldn't wait weeks for construction. Instead of waiting, crates were opened, steel arches were bolted together, and within days, a barren island was filled with buildings. Some Pacific bases grew into small towns with hundreds of Quonset huts, arranged with roads and signs. In Europe, they proved just as essential. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied troops advanced deeper into France, Quonset huts followed closely behind. They popped up in Normandy as makeshift hospitals for the wounded, offices for logistics teams, and barracks for engineers. By the time winter set in during the Battle of the Bulge, Quonset huts served as heated shelters, offering relief to troops from the freezing Belgian forests. But perhaps the most unexpected uses were in extreme climates. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, huts were built to withstand hurricane-force winds and intense cold. In North Africa, they were placed in dusty camps under the harsh sun, where their curved steel roofs reflected heat far better than canvas tents could. The principle remained the same across every environment, a flat-pack building that could be shipped and raised faster than any traditional structure. The global reach of the Quonset hut was staggering. By 1945, they could be found on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers joked that you could always tell where the Americans had been by spotting those steel half-circles on the horizon. They became symbols of the US military presence, recognizable even to civilians who had never seen one before. And it wasn't just Americans who used them. Allied nations received Quonset huts through Lend-Lease programs, setting them up in Britain, Australia, and even the Soviet Union. They became universal because they worked, and because no other country had solved the problem of mobile housing on such a large scale. The huts became so ubiquitous that many soldiers believed they would last forever. They transformed barren islands into functional cities, brought order to chaos, and provided the infrastructure troops needed to keep fighting thousands of miles from home. If war is about logistics, the Quonset hut was one of America's most underrated weapons. By the end of the war, it didn't matter if you were on a Pacific atoll, a French farmyard, or an Arctic outpost. You would see the same curved roofs standing against the sky. They were proof that America hadn't just shipped men overseas. It had shipped an entire civilization with them. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most expected the Quonset hut to fade away with the war. After all, these steel arches were meant to be temporary, a quick solution to an urgent problem. But that's not what happened. Instead, they embarked on a second life, one that would shape post-war America in ways no one had foreseen. First, there was the immediate issue: what to do with all the huts. With over 100,000 built, the US military suddenly had a surplus. Many were dismantled and sold for scrap, but thousands were either sent back home or left standing overseas. The timing was perfect. America was facing its own housing crisis, with millions of GIs returning from the war and the GI Bill fueling a surge in college enrollments. Cities and universities needed places for these men and their new families to live, and fast. Quonset huts became the perfect solution. Across the United States, colleges set up entire villages made of Quonset huts for veterans. At the University of Michigan, for example, returning GIs and their families lived in Quonset hut communities complete with kitchens, bedrooms, and even small yards. Other schools, like the University of Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA, did the same. These villages weren't glamorous, but they provided much-needed homes during a time of crisis. Many wives joked about cooking in a half-cylinder kitchen, but they were affordable, quick, and better than nothing. Beyond universities, entire towns began to develop Quonset hut neighborhoods. Some were turned into churches, diners, and even dance halls. Small businesses bought surplus huts and converted them into workshops, garages, and storage spaces. Farmers also embraced them, using the huts as barns and storage sheds. For a generation that had just experienced a war marked by scarcity, these ready-made structures felt like a blessing, and they didn't stay in America. Overseas, Quonset huts left behind after the war were integrated into local communities. In places like the Philippines, Guam, and parts of Europe, people continued to use them for homes, schools, and shops long after the Americans had left. These huts, originally meant to disappear after the war, became landmarks of survival and recovery. However, they weren't perfect. Families often complained about poor insulation, leaky roofs, and the constant creaking of metal. Winters were harsh, summers unbearably hot. But for many, these huts represented stability in a chaotic post-war world. They were a temporary fix, a roof over their heads while something more permanent was being built. The strangest part. Some huts refused to fade away. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with new siding, windows, or insulation. Even today, you can still find original WWII Quonset huts scattered across American landscapes, some rusted and abandoned, others still in use as storage or workshops. What began as a wartime necessity ended up reshaping post-war America. The Quonset hut became more than just a shelter. It was a bridge from the chaos of war to the promise of rebuilding. Like the soldiers who lived in them, these huts proved tougher and more enduring than anyone ever expected. Even now, nearly 80 years after World War II ended, the Quonset hut hasn't disappeared. It has become a lasting symbol of wartime ingenuity, a testament to how America's industrial might could solve global problems. You can still drive across parts of the United States and spot them, half-cylinders of corrugated steel, standing stubbornly in fields, on college campuses, or behind workshops. Some are weathered and rusted, others lovingly restored, but all of them tell the same story. Built fast, built cheap, and built to last. The legacy of the Quonset hut is more than just nostalgia. Architects and historians often cite it as a precursor to modern prefab housing. The concept of shipping flat-pack kits and assembling them on site is something we now associate with companies like IKEA. But in 1941, America was already doing it on an industrial scale. The Quonset hut proved that modular design could be both practical and scalable. It sparked discussions in the post-war years about addressing housing shortages with mass-produced homes. For veterans, the huts carried deep emotional significance. Many remembered them as the backdrop of their wartime lives, the place where they wrote letters home, laughed with comrades, or collapsed into exhausted sleep after battle. For civilians, the huts became a strange yet familiar sight, dotting landscapes from Rhode Island to the remote Pacific, symbolizing not only military power, but also the American ability to improvise and adapt. Culturally, the Quonset hut even gained icon status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them as backdrops, and writers referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they had become fixtures in American pop culture, embodying both the grit of war and the hope of rebuilding. In some towns, people still gather in community centers that were once surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs arching over dances, meetings, and Sunday services. The story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset form for eco-housing and affordable shelters. The same principles of simplicity, durability, and cost efficiency that worked in 1942 still make sense today. Some companies even manufacture modernized Quonset-style structures for farms, workshops, and homes, showing that the original design never truly went out of style. And perhaps that's the most striking legacy of all. These huts were supposed to be temporary, but like the veterans who once lived in them, they endured. They became markers of a generation's struggle and triumph, still standing as silent witnesses to the war that reshaped the world. So, next time you see one of those curved steel shells standing quietly on the side of a road, remember that this humble hut helped win a world war, housed soldiers on every continent, and shaped post-war life in ways no one could have imagined. In its own quiet way, the Quonset hut is as much a symbol of World War II as the Jeep, the Sherman tank, or the Liberty ship. Proof that sometimes the simplest solutions leave the longest shadows.